Inextricable by TransitUmbra. Summary. After thousands of years, Sauron has met many a creature in Middle-earth, and they've all bent effortlessly to his will. Galadriel is another story entirely. A story that explores the broodier, romantic, more smitten side of Halbrand Sauron and his fraught relationship with rejection. Work text. Night fell like dark, crushed velvet over Lindon. The day's heat ebbed away into the evening, leaving behind only a balmy breeze that swept through the gossamer curtains and the drooping vines of late summer jasmine. Despite the whispering streams and the wind weaving through the orchards, the coming of nightfall brought Galadriel only dread. Over the past few weeks, though the blooms had returned to Lindon and the great tree gave light, something felt disquieted in her soul. She wandered the halls of Lindon, half dreaming, exhausted. The dreams that visited her when she slept now haunted her. Not a moment's peace had lingered since she slipped the diamond ring onto her finger, its weight heavy on her mind. Her sleep came in broken pieces, making her days feel long, surreal, and unrecognizable. Like an unspoken promise, though, it had never occurred to her to remove the ring, least of all when she slept. Instead, she watched the sun slip past the cliffs as the inky evening began to darken the sky, a knot in her stomach. It was night again, and she was weary from trying to run from sleep. She slid into the tufted stool in her bedchamber, unbuttoning the gold buttons at her wrists. The stiff fabric came loose from her forearms, a relief from how stifled she'd felt all day. She folded back her sleeves and removed the laurel-shaped combs from her hair, shaking her braids loose. They tumbled down over her face, and her eyes slid closed as the tension eased gently from her temples. She used her fingers to massage the rest of the headache out of her scalp. As she did, though, she remembered that she needed to draft another letter to Eregion to follow up on her first, which had likely failed to reach them at this point. Part of her did not want to linger on why that could have been. She took a deep sigh, forcing herself to get up and cross the room to her writing desk. She used her fingers to pluck a fresh piece of parchment and a clean quill from her desk, sliding them over in front of her. In the low light of the bedchamber, she squinted tiredly at the blank sheet for a moment. Galadriel got as far as addressing the letter before she felt her head lowering towards the desk, eyelids low and heavy. Sleep took her like a child into a mother's arms. It was unclear how much time had passed when she woke again, hair unmade and still in the day's dress, asleep at her writing desk. She put out the sputtering lantern and leaned back in the chair, trying to reach the back buttons of her dress. The buttons had been easy to button this morning, but now, with tired hands and a tired head, her coordination felt unfocused. Her fingers fumbled, trying to pick at them, frustration building. It was already well past the hour to put herself into a bed, yet the call of sleep had to be stalled because she couldn't seem to get out of her dress. Galadriel felt a flash of anger at herself. She should have picked something simpler to wear today, with fewer trappings to keep her locked in smothering layers of fabric. An intrusive thought crossed her mind unhelpfully about potentially being stuck in the dress until she could find someone to help her tomorrow morning, and she could feel her breath shorten. Her fingers began to scrabble in earnest now, at the buttons at her spine, face growing red with panic. She just wanted to rest. She felt a sweep of fingers brush hers aside, astutely unbuttoning the back of her gown with ease. Galadriel froze, feeling those same fingers hook into the back collar of her dress and pulled it down, exposing the curve of her shoulders. "You have such a lovely neck, did you know that?" came a murmuring voice. She shut her eyes tight, knowing in that moment she had slipped into sleep. If she kept her eyes closed and ignored his presence, it was possible she could simply slip back into a dreamless slumber. But instead she felt a warm palm cup the nape of her neck, brushing upwards into her hair. Fingers massaged the curve of her head gently. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she found herself sitting back at her vanity in front of her mirror. Halbrand stood behind her, in black riding robes, rubbing the tension from her scalp. He leaned down to eye level with her in the mirror, lips too close for comfort near her ear. Fair as the sea and the sun, his eyes glittered as they scanned the details of her face, with a fondness that made her stomach tight. "Honeyed words until you're met with a no." She shook her head and ignored him. Getting up from the tufted stool, she could feel the anger roll off of him as she walked away. "But if you did say no, I would have left you be. I remember plainly telling you so," she said, moving towards her sword on the trunk by her bed. He stepped towards her, and she felt herself hurtled through space for a split second. She flinched and found herself in bed. There was a tug at the sleeves of her dress, and then at the hem as it slid away from her body. Laying there, she was less disquieted and undressed, and more relieved by the restrictive fabric falling away, finally allowing her to breathe. Her skin sang as the cold night air hit her exposed chest and calves. Galadriel sighed and tried to sit up, but found her body heavy. She could feel the down covers shift behind her as Halbrand's body sunk down into the bed with her, closer than he had ever been. "My dear, I remember you telling me you could not stand by my side because you did not believe in my vision." And? Galadriel jumped as she felt his hand slip down her back, resting at the dip of her waist. You never told me that you did not love me. He pulled her close, aligning their bodies. She could feel the stubble of his chin against the nape of her neck and shivered. The question threw her off balance. She felt her whole body shiver, her thighs squeezing together. Before she allowed the moan to escape her lips, she opened her eyes and felt the world lurch again. Her horizon realigned and she found herself standing in a plush, fur-lined gown in a wintry garden. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind. Halbrand came into the weak winter sunlight, snowflake in his brown hair. This time he wore the clothes of a king. A dark midnight blue doublet trimmed with grey fur, and a thick embroidered mantle that sat wrapped around his regal shoulders. Nestled in his brown hair was an obsidian circlet, shining bleak light. Its carved black point sat poised on his head, every single snowflake down, avoiding the circlet. He took her hand and laid it gently over his warm forearm, leading her through the garden. What is this place? Looking up and over the manicured snow-coat to the dizzyingly tall tower that stretched above the garden. The deep black slabs that made up the tower looked to be carved from the gullet of Middle-earth itself. Looking at its looming presence against the sallow grey sky made her apprehensive. This is the stronghold I'd like to build, with you as the lady of the land. This garden is one that I thought of building. She took a look around and realized that the hedges loomed higher than shoulder height, made up of twisting, gnarled branches of old, dead vine. Each turn took them deeper into the garden, with no clear path back out. This was no garden, but a maze. And how exactly would you make a garden bloom in winter? Galadriel asked to distract him, wondering what his goal was. Was it to further deceive her? To crawl further into her mind and exploit the tiny pinprick he'd created for himself? Seasons are the limitations of mortals and man. For you, I would replace the sun. I mean that, he said, pausing in the snow, his head tilted sideways, studying with his dark green inscrutable. The others cannot and do not appreciate your mind. You're simply commander to them. Another body at that wretched war table, a cog in the machine. What's wrong with being of service to my people? She asked, chin rising with pride. Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Always of service. Always ready to fight someone else's war, do someone's bidding. Do you even know who you are without the armor on? Can you even remember a time someone appreciated you for your wit, those eyes, instead of how useful you could be? His last comment stung her to the core. She pulled her arm back from him, but he caught her hand gently to keep her close. But I'm also useful to you, aren't I? Galadriel did her best to keep her voice even, glaring at him. Which is why you're here, invading my dreams. After all the deceiving, you decided you couldn't convince me in person anymore. Halbrand's fingers slipped down and around her forearm, pulling her close. A well-worn soldier's gesture between them. Such heat in those eyes, he smiled, but it never reached his solemn eye. I never once lied about why I wanted you here, Galadriel. About that, perhaps. What about all the other times you've lied? He swept the fair hair from her shoulder lovingly, unafraid for some reason to dote on her, though she'd more than likely stick him with her sword if given the chance. To you I have never lied. Many assumptions were made, but I have always been honest with you, even about the reason I was jailed in Numenor. No, that's not right. She shook her head, trying to remind herself that this was his way. Even with Finrod, he'd used her brother's face against her, to confuse her and whisper palatable lies into her head. You were jailed because of a dispute about a woman. He swept a stray snowflake off the edge of her proud cheek. Who do you think that woman was? Foolishly, she let her eyes finally meet his, at length. She didn't even know what she was looking for, since he was entirely impossible to read. Except this time, he looked surprisingly sincere. She shook her head to get him out of her mind. Why in the world would you have gotten in a dispute about me? Halbrand smiled, remembering the moment, a slightly bloodthirsty edge at the corners of his mouth. He asked if I was your companion, though he doubted it since he assumed you preferred someone of higher breed. Galadriel scoffed. What difference would breeding have? It's a ridiculous statement anyway, given who and what you are. To her surprise, Halbrand's pupils had a brief, dark flush of satisfaction before they left hers, shaken. Maybe that was an honesty, or acceptance he had not expected from Halbrand. No, Sauron, she had to remind herself, had been weaving duplicitous webs since the first day. She had to be careful not to misstep again, even if he appeared to her hurt. Any vulnerability had been calculated from the start, yet she felt strangely taken off guard. His reactions were like acting. She lifted a hand to his jaw, bringing him back to his brooding eyes did not immediately. Did you feel as though I'd agree with him? When his eyes finally rose again, they looked conflicted. Bottomless green, like the churning ocean, almost resentful that she was looking upon a moment of weakness. Uncertainty. Halbrand, she said. She was unsure how to put it all into words, but hoped her tone would convey her meaning, like it always had between them. Whatever portion of it had been real, at the very least. His eyes slid shut, an ironic smile sliding across his lips. Why do you call me that when you know my true name? You once told me that you've had many names. Halbrand is how I know you best. she said simply, with a slight touch of sadness. His hand came to wrap, pulling her hand down to rest against his chest, right above his. Is that so? Her fingers relaxed, and his grip so tender and gentle that it felt like he was afraid he'd crush her very hand. No one had held her this gently in quite some time. She felt his heartbeat at her fingertips through his doublet, skipping quick as a hare across forest foliage. Halbrand took her other hand, and then took one sideways step in the snow. Instead of the sound of crunching ice beneath their feet, she could hear the gentle rustle of soft grass. She looked back up, and could see that they were now back in Lindon, except in a place she knew did not exist within the city. It was a fine ballroom, nestled amongst the birch trees. Elven lanterns hung down from the treetops, dripping with berries and ivy. Along the perimeter of the grassy dance floor were beautifully panelled silvery mirrors which caught the slanting moonlight in 100 enchanting angles, illuminating the centre of the room. This time, Halbrand wore the slate-grey elven tunic they'd given him upon his arrival to Lindon. An elven torque necklace sat around his graceful neck, except the steel was obsidian black, glittering in the lantern light. A small, black circlet sat upon his head, where the moonlight did not dare touch. She peered down and saw that she had on a gilded, sheer gown, the fabric of which shifted like sunlight on a gently rippling lake. In the reflection of the many mirrors of the ballroom, she could see a marbled black gold circlet around her head. He shifted his grip around her right hand and moved his other to her waist, sweeping her across the room. The steps came easy to her, not because she'd ever had any success with dancing before, but because the steps seemed to be memorized within her body. A slow step backwards, and then one to the left, a soft pressure at her waist where Halbrand held her to indicate it was time to turn. He swept her up in a turn, the ballroom taking a dizzying spin around her. When they came back to a rest, Halbrand was resting in. I'm sorry for your brother, Galadriel. She felt a stinging at her and a tightening of her. Which part? All of it. Hadn't known. You or him, I was just another soldier carrying out orders. Just like Finrod. Don't, she managed, closing her eyes but feeling her world spin. Don't you dare utter his name and act like you were just another soldier carrying out orders. You made orders of your own, to torture Finrod for whatever information you could get out of him. Halbrand grabbed her by each shoulder, giving her a soft shake. Galadriel, this is a war, and we were enemies. At the time it was in our best interest to get whatever information we could manage from a force that wanted to eradicate us for simply existing. And now? She asked angrily. Eyes open and trained on Halbrand's, he faltered. There are regrets. I see now that Morgtoth needlessly positioned us as enemies, and back then I had not known what it was to know you. And what is it that you know? She asked bitterly. That I love you, Galadriel, and that I could search the realms over 100 times before I found a light that shone as sweetly as you, a single bird or brook that could mimic the melody of your voice. Not a single day goes by where I don't think about that moment in the woods, where you told me that you felt it too. Galadriel wavered, the rest of the words falling short of her. Halbrand brushed his thumb over her bottom lip, his eyes peering directly into her to the very core. I have thought many times back to that day, and how I should have kissed you then, even to feel what these lips were like, just for a fleeting moment. What stopped you? She asked, the words bubbling forth before she could stop them. Halbrand leaned forward, running his lips, feather light, over her earlobe, her jaw. We were interrupted, don't you remember? What stopped you afterwards? She said, unable to hide the faint grip of sorrow that squeezed in her throat. She felt a sensation of falling, deep in her stomach, reminding herself that they were still waltzing, even if their feet had slowed to a halt on the empty dance floor. Halbrand traced soft kisses from her jaw, up her face, and paused at the very corner of her lips. Am I allowed to now? Do whatever suits you, Galadriel spat out. But she knew he was close to feel how subtly her lips still, the magnetic pull of his mouth to so delayed by human circumstance. Are you sure about that? What difference would it make in a dream? She said, holding coldly still, careful to keep their lips just slightly too far away. Her world lurched once more, and she found herself back in her bed in Lindon, the lantern sputtering in the dark bedchamber. She was sitting up with the down covers and pillows scattered across the bed, and bare legs stretched in front of her. Her pulse quickened when she felt Halbrand shift behind her, running a tanned hand along the pale expanse of her thigh. His other hand came up to cup her jaw, tilting her head upwards. Her mouth found his, and she could feel the breath stolen out of her as their lips met. Her loose hair spilled out over her breasts and abdomen. Fingers wandered into the crevice of her thighs where they met. He slipped between her sweat-slicked legs and parted them. Galadriel shivered into their kiss, feeling the touch of his fingers dribble down the inside of her thighs like treacle. When they reached the most sensitive spot, where her leg met her hips, she moaned into his mouth, and he leaned in, lapping it from her tongue, like he could subsume her very pleasure. When was the last time someone saw you as a woman and touched you like one? He murmured into her neck, fingers dancing softly over the space beneath her belly button, tracing burning circles into her hot skin and sliding lower. Her breath quickened, trying to keep focused and aware as she felt her willpower slip away. Halbrand, she said, more a plea than an admonishment. He laid kisses behind her ear, along her neck, and draped them along her damp shoulder. This time, he did not seem bothered by her using this name with him. Yes, my dear? It's best we don't, she said, trying to get her heart to stop hammering against her chest. Halbrand's deft fingers parted her lips, sliding one middle finger inside her briefly. When his fingers came away wet, she could see how satisfied he was that she couldn't hide her body's responses from him. Is that what you really want? Look how you are just from being kissed. After all this time, you're still trying to run from how you feel. You assume to know how I feel now, she said, through bared teeth, trying not to focus on his hands. Or you want to get away from me, but we're inextricable. Like the sky and the horizon, you cannot get away from something inside of you. Galadriel shuddered, back arching and hips rising to meet his touch. He shifted his hips beneath her, pulling his breeches down hungrily. His reddened cock sat weeping against her entrance as she sank back down onto his lap. Be honest for once in your life, Galadriel, and tell me you want me. Halbrand, she said, more a moan than a response. Halbrand's arms wound around her in an embrace as he positioned himself against her entrance. What is it you want, fair Galadriel? Will you have someone of my breeding after all? He chuckled, leaving fiery kisses along her sensitive ears, his hot breath against her skin. Please, she gasped. Her body responded before she could catch herself, tilting her head, giving him more purchase along her long neck. He responded in kind by kissing the salt from the crook of her neck. With one quick upwards jerk of his hips, he was inside her, groaning and holding onto her thighs against the tight, overwhelming squeeze of her around his cock. His surprised groan escaped through clenched teeth, and she could feel the pulse of him inside her, already so close to come. She caught herself taking pleasure in the knowledge that her very body could make him lose control. How much of this is even real to you? She asked, clenching around him, slowly lifting her hips upward. His fingers gripped down around her hips, slowing her down. Galadriel, his desperation did not seem scripted, and neither did his moans. He pressed her against himself so they were flush against one another, her moon-pale skin luminous in the lamplight. She reached behind her, snaking her slick arms around his neck. Her hips slammed down on his, moans escaping her bow-shaped mouth like prayers. His cock was reaching deep inside her, hitting a spot that made her body shake each time she came back down to meet his hip. He groaned, and she knew he was close to losing it. Something inside her burned at this knowledge, increasing her hips as she sat. None of it matters anyway, isn't that right? Competitive till the end, he said, kissing her shoulder, wincing as her hips came back down on his cock, barely holding on. That's not how it works in the slightest. So what are you waiting for? She said, increasing her pace. I can feel how close you are. To make you come, he replied, reaching between her legs and rubbing the sensitive nub of her clitoris. She moaned out loud, hips jumping upward. His fingers made quick work of her clit as he sunk himself deep inside her. In 5 short strokes he felt her tighten around him, impossibly tight, and her body. A shuddering breath escaped her lips as he collected her in his arms, coming wet and copiously onto his cock as he emptied himself inside her. They laid there, tangled limbs, as Halbrand traced swirling patterns into her sensitive skin. Maybe we can have our alone time this way, more often. Galadriel lifted her fair head to glower at him, but had made no effort yet to get up. I will think about it,